And so what all of this is a product and symptom of is basically what happens when institutions confuse neutrality with outright cowardice. The CBC didn't want to seem partisan. So instead of acknowledging the situation at hand and the actual power dynamics that were playing out, of these fascistic bad faith actors exploiting legal loopholes to disrupt the election debate, instead of just being forthcoming about it, they played dumb. They omitted it. And this, what is essentially an abdication of duty, it isn't a failure of any individual journalists, although it would be nice if, Rosie Barton or that fucking weasel, David Cochran, had some type of agency and had some type of integrity as a journalist. When they hear, Indigenous genocide denial, that they correct it on their own volition rather than doing it after they're prompted by their producer, which I'm sure is what happened. But again, like I said, this isn't the doing or the failure of any individual journalist or anyone at the CBC. What it is a systemic feature. It's a symptom. It's not a flaw. And what it is the white settler consensus being distilled and permeated through the national broadcaster. Nowhere is this failure any clearer than when the CBC is faced directly with Indigenous genocide denial. Especially during the French debate on Wednesday night, a Rebel News reporter pushed the line that essentially that no bodies have ever been found at any residential school sites, which is really parroting the denialist rhetoric that has circulated since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And again, instead of immediately correcting or challenging this denial in real time, the CBC just sat back and said nothing. No pushback, no fact check, just essentially playing the victim. And so you see, like, props to Jagmeet Singh for not even addressing it, but again, failed to really correct it. But that's not his job. You know whose job it is the CBC, and their silence in face of something like that it's not neutral. It's complicity. To refuse to confront Indigenous genocide denial is essentially to enable it. And it sends a broader signal to the public that this is just, another opinion among opinions, a contested claim, a matter of perspective. And that's exactly how colonial violence survives. Not through brute force, but through the quiet murmur of institutional deflection and the permeation of this mythology. But again, the facts cannot be disputed. We know ground penetrating radar has revealed numerous unmarked graves, oral histories corroborated systemic abuses and disappearances, numerous Indigenous residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission confirmed over 4,100 deaths, with that number being far higher. Okay. But these people will not be satisfied until they dig up the bones of these children. And this is the thing, is that they're going to get their wish. And this is why they're doing it, because the more that Canada is developed, the more that there's going to be bodies that are going to be dug up in places that were either former federal lands or former church-owned lands that get developed, especially where I live here in Montreal. This is going to be something that I'm going to cover extensively in some other content that I'm doing. But the point of all of this is, Sue-Ann Levy, National Post pushed far-right Indigenous genocide denial. It's essentially real estate developer propaganda. It serves multiple purposes, but the reason that it's getting backed by big money, by lobbyists, is because the point of it is to sow doubt, so that the more that they develop in places that haven't been touched in Canada, in the places that there are these unknown mass graves and things like that, it'll sow doubt and it'll be easier for them to cover it up. And this is the thing, is that the CBC just sits back and allows it. And it's absolutely disgusting. Like, the CBC, it often markets itself as this bastion of objectivity. But I gotta say, objectivity in the face of settler colonial violence and overt fascism is not neutrality. It is the ideology of the status quo. It is what has allowed powerful institutions to perpetuate harm while insisting that they're just reporting the facts. And essentially what it ends up happening is that the CBC really just serves as this arm of the state to push the politics of the country towards the right of center, while maintaining this veneer of liberalism. And it's a perpetuation of very much the same colonial underpinnings that make up this country. And these debates on Wednesday and Thursday night were a perfect example of these issues. And the national media and the state broadcasters, their willingness to ignore or minimize the significance of such a statement being said on national airwaves. And by doing so, it serves to maintain that colonial footprint that this country was founded on. It's what lets white hosts sit among, indigenous guests and nod with and put on this solemn tone and use words like reconciliation while the CBC newsroom slashes budgets for indigenous reporting. It's what lets them broadcast a debate which no one in the discussion of pipelines and indigenous sovereignty, at no point did anyone mention the RCMP's violent suppression of indigenous land defenders. And then they call it a balanced discussion. And in these types of moments of crisis, the role of the public broadcaster should be to clarify, contextualize, and to confront like outright falsehoods. And the CBC did none of those things. They just sat there, remaining completely silent in the face of active, harmful disinformation. It chose like impartiality over the truth, decorum over justice, and cowardice over professionalism. And again, the choice is not an individual journalistic failure. It is a moral, systemic one. It is about the entire ecosystem that the problem permeates out of. It is the white settler consensus that defines what is quote unquote legitimate politics. And it is emblematic of the broader pathology in Canadian political life, this pathology that needs to avoid discomfort and remain impartial in the face of dangerous extremism, violent extremism, hateful extremism, and to uphold that illusion of civility, that Canadian place of being polite and civil and reasonable, that idea of a democratic and fair debate when the floor is completely let go and it's just turned into an outright clown show. But this is that sleepwalking. It's the left-right fascism. It's what happens between a status quo liberal and a further and further extreme far right. And that's what the political framing is right now between the liberals and the conservatives. And this is the conditions that are created when, the national broadcaster sees Indigenous genocide and a historical footprint both being denied and happening directly in their face. And they just sit there and do nothing. They remain impartial, and they treat themselves as the victims of this fascist creep when they are the ones who create the conditions to this to be allowed to happen. And it's just ridiculous. It also treats this like what they're calling like the rise of fascism, the rise of violent extremism. What they will even say themselves is this dangerous political climate as it creeps more and more and gets more and more extreme. They just slot that in a segment between weather and sports. They don't give it any type of substance because they don't hold any type of position. And it's the consensus rotting is what it is. And the smell of it, the wretched smell of it was unmistakable for these two debates.